Alright, hey guys, we're back. We're reading The Assault, and today I'm going to be going through the fourth episode, chapter 1, 2, 3. Like 1, and then going towards chapter 3. I'm also reading chapter 3. Yeah, okay. In Love 2, he simply let things happen to him. Every few weeks, a different girl would come and sit on his worn-out couch, usually with her legs folded under her, and he would explain the mechanism of a sextant one more time. This never bored him. He was fascinated by the shiny brass instruments, with their small mirrors, measured scales, and little telescopes, containing the night sky and the stars. Often, the girls couldn't understand the apparatus, but always they understood the absorption with which he explained, and which, therefore, was directed a little at them. At times, the couch remained empty for a week or two, which didn't bother him much. It was not his style to go to a bar to pick someone up. In 1959, he passed his final medical exams and became an assistant anesthesiologist, rented a larger apartment with lots of light in the neighborhood of the Lesser Plain. Every morning, he walked the few blocks to Will Plain Hospital, which had been called the Western Hospital during the war. In the streets around the complex of the buildings, there was always much coming and going of ambulances, visitors, and patients taking a first stroll, wearing striped pajamas under their overcoats. Doctors walked from one building to another, their white coats casually unbuttoned. Anton, his head slightly to one side, tossing back his hair now and then, somewhat careless in manner, aroused the mother instinct in the nurses bicycling by, who would then end up on his couch. Sometimes he had to pass the shed on which Lazarus had been written, but this reminded him less and less of Schultz, who had been brought here dying or already dead. He met his wife in London in 1960, when he was there on Christmas vacation. During the day, he strolled about the city, bought clothes on Regent Street, and dropped in on the dealers in antique navigational instruments behind the British Museum. At night, he usually went to a concert. Most men still wore bowlers and carried rolled-up umbrellas. When he lunched in a pub, the umbrella stand would be full of those endearing instruments. One rainy afternoon, strolling down Whitehall between its colossal monuments to power, where the Horse Guard performed its inexplicable dances like strutting roosters, he decided to enter Westminster Abbey for the first time. It was full of foreign tourists and day-trippers from the country. He had brought a guidebook bound in the kind of purplish-red common throughout England. For the central nave, just at the entrance to the choir, it listed the 170 graves of the finest flower of the nation, dating from the last 6th century. He closed the book. Everywhere, on the pavement, in the walls, and on the pillars, were sculptures and inscriptions. In the chapel, statues and tombstones stood just as if they were on display at a second-hand furniture auction. In the narrow passage along the choir, the dead were aligned end to end, the way patients sometimes lay on stretchers in the hall in front of operating rooms. Only here, on their backs, in marble, on top of the scarfy, they were permanently anesthetized. He tried to imagine what would happen on Judgment Day, when they would all rise from their tombs and be introduced to each other. These hundreds of heroes, noblemen and artists, the most exclusive club in the United Kingdom. Royalty lay in the chapel behind the main altar. Past the throne of the kings and queens shuffled the people who would never be buried here. At the coronation chair, they came to a standstill. He himself was fascinated by this throne on which almost every ruler had been crowned since the 14th century. Ancient oak, simply ordinated, the back scratched full of initials from one century or another. In the true spirit of historical veracity, it had never been cleaned up. Under the wooden seat, a large stone, the stone of Scone. Anton opened his guidebook again. The stone had once been the pillow of the biblical Jacob, and had ended up in Ireland, via Egypt and Spain during the 8th century, before Christ. Then 1,400 years later in Scotland, and finally in England, where it could be seen at this very moment, at this very spot. Just as the real truth about the kings all around him could be found only in Shakespeare's plays, so also this legend about the stone seemed to reveal an essential truth. Only if the Irish claimant to the throne had royal blood would the stone grown at the coronation time. Otherwise, not. Anton burst out laughing and said out loud, "How true?" Upon which a young woman next to him asked, "What's true?" He looked at her, and at that moment, everything was decided. It was her glance, the look in her eyes, and her hair, thick, springy, reddish hair. Her name was Saskia de Graaf, and she was a stewardess with KLM. After having visited the Poets' Corner as well, they went off together. She had to pick her father up at a club in St. James. Every year, he went to London for Christmas to meet his old wartime friends. As they arrived at the club building and made plans to meet in Amsterdam, they saw a general come down the stairs and step into a waiting car with a military driver. A week later, during the first meeting in the lobby of the Hotel des Indes, de Graaf inquired tactfully about his family. Anton said that his father had been a clerk at law in courts in Haarlem, but that both his parents had died long ago. Not till 6 months later, one warm evening in Athens, where de Graaf was ambassador, did he tell the whole story to his future father-in-law. Having heard him out, de Graaf remained silent and gazed from the darkened room in the brilliant perfumed garden, vibrant with the chirping of crickets, where a small fountain murmured as it spouted up in the air. A servant in a white jacket clinked some pieces of ice together on the terrace. Saskia and her mother were sitting out there. The Acropolis could be seen in the distance between cypresses and pine trees. All de Graaf said after a while was, even the good has its evil side in this world. Guys, annotate that part. That's important. But there's still another side. Oh, that's even more important. Annotate. He himself had belonged to an organization that coordinated all the resistance groups and, as such, had been in direct contact with the exiled government in London. He spoke little of those days. All Anton knew about them was what Saskia had told him, but he had no desire to hear more. He could probably have read up on the subject in the reports from the Parliamentary Inquest Committee, but he didn't. A year after the first meeting, they got married. His uncle was not there. A senseless auto accident had put an end to his life. Bro, what? Shortly after his wedding, Anton got a permanent job, and with financial help from de Graaf, they bought half of a two-family house in the neighborhood behind the Conservatoire. Chapter 2. During the heat wave at the beginning of June 1966, Saskia had to attend the funeral of one of her father's friend, an important journalist and poet by the name Sjoerd, whom she, too, had known after the war. She asked Anton to come with her, and he had managed to get the day off. He wanted to take their 4-year-old. Yo! Why are we skipping so much stuff? He wanted to take their 4-year-old, Sandra, along as well. Should we, Ton? Asked Saskia. Death isn't exactly for children. Fire annotation yet again. I've never heard such a ridiculous platitude, he said. It sounded sharper than he intended. He excused himself and kissed her. They decided to go to the beach after the funeral. His father-in-law, who was as old as the century, had just retired and was living in a country house in Gerland. He would be coming by car. Saskia called and suggested that he pick them up. Then they could have coffee together first. A typical country dweller, he replied that he wouldn't be caught dead in Amsterdam. What did they think that he wanted? What did he think? That he wanted to be attacked by a game of hippie provos? He laughed as he said it. But he didn't come, though God knows he faced worse dangers in life. The funeral was in a village north of Amsterdam. The Steenbricks parked their car on the outskirts and walked to the small church. The two adults perspiring in the dark clothes, while Sandra dressed in white. Didn't mind the sun. In the village square was a crowd of men and women, mostly older, who all seemed to be acquainted. They greeted each other, not somberly and mournfully, but with laughter and exuberant embraces. There were many photographers. A cabinet minister, the one who had recently been in the news much in connection with the Amsterdam riots, stepped out of a big black Cadillac. He, too, was greeted with kisses and slaps on the back. These people all fought against the Germans, Anton told his daughter. In the war, she said, as if she knew all about it, and twisted her doll's head with a decisive gesture. Anton surveyed the scene with a continuous feeling of excitement. He knew no one. Saskia greeted a few people, though she had forgotten their names. Inside the bare, Protestant church, where the organ was already playing, they sat in the last row. When the coffin was carried in, everyone stood up. He put his arm around Sandra, who asked in a whisper whether the gentleman was inside there now. On de Graaf's arm, the widow entered. Sad, of course, but facing the people with high head, nodding now and then with a gentle smile. Suddenly, Sandra called out, "Grandpa." He turned to her briefly and winked. They sat down in front, near the cabinet minister. Anton recognized the mayor of Amsterdam. The funeral address was given by a famous clergyman who had spent years in a concentration camp. His delivery was so melodramatic that he seemed to have acquired his rhetorical manner by overcoming a speech deficit, a defect, like Domontrient's training with the pebbles in his mouth. He made Sandra look up and wink with amusement at her father. Anton, only half listening, was struck by the profile of a woman across the aisle and a few rows ahead. For some reason, it made him think of a sword, with its sharp tip planted straight in the ground. She must have been about 45. Her dark hair, thick, bushy, was graying in places. They joined the rear of the procession to the cemetery behind the church. During the short walk on the street and then along the gravel path, everyone was again deep in conversation. People were waving, some walking ahead, others falling back to the rear. It was not so much a funeral as a reunion. "They feel at home again," said Saskia. "I hope no one finds out they're all here in one place." "What do you mean, no one?" "The Germans, of course." "Don't be silly." Photographers were once more tracking down celebrities. The villagers stood looking on from across the street. All these years, most of them had probably been unaware of the important personage living in their midst. Boys on motorbikes observed the procession with mocking faces, but their motors were silent. Obviously, something about these men and women, a few of them disabled, impressed the boys enough to behave themselves. "Papa?" "Yes." "What is war, really?" "A big quarrel. Two bunches of people who want to chop each other's heads off." You don't have to overdo it," said Saskia. "You think so?" Anton laughed. At the cemetery, a tight circle had formed around the grave, and the Steenwicks couldn't see much. Sandra got bored, so Saskia took her hand and led her on a walk. Behind him, he could hear her reading inscriptions on the grave and explaining them. Now and then, ignoring the fact that his clothes were sticking to him, he lifted his face to the bright sun. The soft murmur in the last rows of the crowd did not die down until the widow herself addressed them, but her words were lost to him in the wide open space of this sunny day. The birds flying overhead must have seen the people gathered here in the open landscape on the polders around the small, dark hole in the earth, like a big eye looking up at heaven. The Steenwicks finally managed to offer their condolences to the widow at the end of the reception line in the parish house. Then, between cars starting up, they crossed over to the cafe on the other side of the street. The few outside tables were already taken by the villagers, and inside, too, was busy. A crowd gathering at the bar. Tables were being pushed together, ties loosened, jackets removed, and loud calls issued for beer, coffee, and sandwiches. The jukebox was playing Strangers in the Night. The cabinet minister was there talking to the burgomaster and scribbling something on the back of a cigarette box. Famous writers were present, as well as a notorious prophet. Just as Saskia suggested that they go somewhere else, her father came in. He sat down at a large table in the back, probably reserved with about 7 other men, some whose faces were familiar to Anton. Evidently, his wife had gone back to the house with the widow and the family. When he saw his daughter and Anton, he beckoned to them. At the table, he was in his element. In no time, 3 conversations were going. In the one that he joined, he was on the defensive without losing his good humor, evidently quite aware that he was in control. A man with a blonde forelock and still blonder eyebrows leaned toward him and said that he was becoming a real old bore. How in heaven's name could he compare the Vietnamese Liberation Front to the Nazis? The trouble was that he thought Americans were still the same as in World War II, but actually it was the Americans who had changed and who should now be compared to Nazis. De Graaf leaned back with a laugh, holding onto the edge of his table with outstretched arms, so that the men on his right and left also had to lean backwards. With the thinning white hair and imposing features, he looked like the leader at a gathering commissars on the chairman presiding at a board meeting. "Jap, my dear fellow," he began condescendingly, but the blond man interrupted him at once. "Oh, I know. Next you'll say I must have forgotten that the Americans came to our rescue. That's not at all what I was going to say. I'm not so sure. In any case, I haven't forgotten a thing. But you did forget something. And what's that, may I ask? The Russians also came to our rescue, even though we didn't see them here in our streets. They're the ones who defeated the German army, and it's still the Russians who are on the right side in Vietnam." The man in the black mustache who sat behind de Graaf's left arm said icily, "How about leaving this kind of talk to other people?" "But it's the truth," said Jap. The Russians have been de-Stalinized, but the Americans have become mass murderers. The man on the left shrugged and smiled politely under his mustache, suggesting that he agreed. He felt that Jap had started a pointless quarrel. "Dirty commies, all of them," said DeGaff, good-naturedly in Anton's direction. First-class fellows." Anton smiled back. Obviously, this conversation was the kind of game that they had played many times before. Sure, said Jap. "First-class fellows. But from 1944 on, Jarrett, you and your military government were no longer so much against the Germans as against the first-class fellows." Anton's father-in-law was not named Jarrett, but Gottfried Leopold Jeremohe. In this company, they apparently still addressed each other with their underground pseudonyms. Jap, too, was obviously not named Jap. Well, what do you expect? The Krauts had been defeated after all. Innocently, de Graaf looked at Jap. "We were supposed to exchange one tyranny for another?" Gradually, his smile faded. "Go to hell," said Jap. "You ought to be grateful for us. If you'd had your way in 1945, you wouldn't have been expelled from the party as you are now. You'd have faced the firing squad. Certainly, in your ambiguous position, you wouldn't have had a chance with the Stalinists. No more than Slansky in Czechoslovakia. I was posted in Prague at the time of his execution. You owe your life to the military government." And since Jap didn't answer, always better to be at the head of the soccer club on the dung heap of history than dead. Right? The large man on de Graaf's other side, a well-known poet with a satanic expression in his slanted eyes, crossed his arms and began to laugh. "I have a feeling this is going to be an interesting conversation," he said. "Sure," said Jap. "Let him win this argument for all I care." "Do you know these verses of Stroeder's?" asked de Graaf, and, raising his finger, he declaimed, "When to the will of tyrants a nation's head is bowed, it loses more than life and goods. Its very lights are out." "Amazing. The uses of poetry to justify the bombing of villages with napalm," said the man with the mustache. "But of course, that's only in Asia. Besides, during the Indonesian troubles, you were already playing a peculiar role. Indies lost, heavy the cost, and other such nonsense. Not a very good rhyme, if you ask me, but ask our expert here about that. An insignificant rhyme," said the poet. "There you have it. Those very Indonesian police actions cost our deceased friend Stroeder a few years of his life, and yet we've never had it so good in Holland as since we got rid of the Indonesian colonies. Thanks to the help of the Marshall Plan, dear Hank," said de Graaf sweetly, "financed by the Americans, remember? They owed it to us. We don't have to thank them for it. The American Revolution was financed by banks in Amsterdam. That one happened to be the revolt of an English colony, dear Garrett. We're paying back the Marshall Plan to the last penny, whereas I'm not at all sure we got back a cent of the money in the 18th century. Must look it up," said de Graaf. "And I'm no communist, by the way. I'm an anti-fascist. But because communism is the greatest enemy of fascism, I happen to be anti-communist, that's for certain." "Do you know why de Graaf happened to be in the resistance?" Jap asked suddenly. "Do you know who he did to for? Do you know who he did to for? Do you know who he did it for?" Okay. "For the little princesses." His tone implied that he wanted to vomit. "Absolutely," said de Graaf once more with a self-satisfied grin. "An ordinary house of orange fascist. That's what you are, nothing else. I'm getting out of here," said Sasha and stood up. "I don't need this. I see you later." Well, de Graaf explained an honorary title. Anton stood up. The crowd parted to give him a brief glimpse of the woman he had been staring at in the church. In the meantime, his father-in-law was laughing loudly, obviously in his element. "What do you know about the secret charms of the monarchy?" he cried with mock arrogance. "What is more beautiful and uplifting to the soul than the palace of Sarjabardin by night? All the windows lit, black, luminous limousines driving in and out, orders ringing out over the lawns, gentlemen wearing gala uniforms with shiny swords, ladies in evening dress with glistening jewels walking up the steps to the front terrace, being greeted by handsome young officers in the Marines. Inside, the glitter of the chandeliers, lacquey with large silver trays full of glasses of champagne, and perhaps even a glimpse of a member of the royal family, if God be willing. Perhaps even Her Majesty the Queen. And far away in the drizzling rain behind the great gates guarded by military police, the grim populace. I actually think you mean it. By God, said the poet who had predicted that this would be an interesting conversation. Jesus Christ. If I were as much as a bastard as you, I wouldn't even get a single word printed again. Some spit flew out of his mouth and ended up on Degap's dark blue lapel, not far from the decoration in his buttonhole, which, according to some of our more distinguished scholars, would be a blessing for our nation's literature, said de Graaf. Don't let it get to you, man, said Henk to the furious poet. De Graaf pulled out his handkerchief and wiped away the white spit bubble. The knot of his gray tie was perfectly centered and disappeared with an elegant curve inside his vest. Jap, too, had to laugh. The man sitting on the other side of the poet, a prominent publisher, rubbed his hand and exulted. A fierce afternoon. The grim populace, said Hank, has recently been bombarding your beloved royal family with stink bombs. Stink bombs, said de Graaf with a mock content. And that will cost you your head, Hank continued to someone standing behind Anton. Anton turned around. He realized that the heat had felt on his neck all this time came from the powerful Calvinist rump of the cabinet minister. The latter had apparently been following the conversation. Possibly, he said, and then I'll have another drink. He lifted his glass of Dutch gin, exchanged a glance of complacency with de Graaf, and turned away. Suddenly, silence fell at the table. Only the two men sitting on Anton's left were still involved in a subdued, private conversation that they had been carrying out on all the time. Anton caught the following sentence. I shot him first in the back, then in the shoulder, and then in the stomach as I bicycled past him. Far away, deep inside the tunnel of the past, Anton heard the 6 shots ring. First one, then two more, and finally one last shot. His mother looks at his father at the sliding doors. Peter lifts the lid on the carbide lamp. Anton turned to the man who he had been sitting next to all this time. Before he knew what he was doing, he already asked, wasn't there a 4th and 5th shot, and then one more, a 6th? The other looked at him and half closed his eyes. How do you know? Are we talking about Faki Ploeg in Harlem? A few seconds went by, and the other man asked slowly, who are you? How old are you? I was living there. It happened in front of my house, at least. In front of your... The man caught his breath. He had understood at once. Only at the operating table had Anton seen anyone lose color so rapidly. The man had the swollen, blotchy, red complexion of someone who drinks too much. As if the light had changed, he now turned as pale and waxen as old ivory. Anton began to tremble. Oh no, said the man 2 chairs away. Now you're in trouble. Everyone at the table noticed at once that something was wrong. The silence deepened. Then confusion set in. With everyone talking at once, some standing up, de Graaf wanted to come between them, explaining that Anton was his son-in-law, but the man insisted on handling it himself. Then, to Anton, as if he wanted to fight it out, come outside. He took his jacket off from the back of the chair, grabbed Anton by the hand, and pulled him along through the crowd, as if he had been a child. And that's how it felt to Anton. The hot hand of the man 20 years his senior dragging him along, something he had never felt with his uncle, only sometimes with his father. In the other part of the cafe, no one was aware of what was going on. Laughing, they let the two pass. It's been a hard day's night, It's been a hard day's night, the Beatles were singing on the jukebox. Outside, he was struck by the silence. The village square lay shimmering in the sun. Here and there, groups of people were standing about, but Saskia and Sandra were nowhere in sight. Come, said the man, having surveyed the scene. They crossed to the cemetery and entered through the wrought iron gate. Villagers had gathered around the open grave to read the inscriptions on the ribbons and cards that accompanied the flowers. Chickens from a neighboring farm walked about the path and the other graves. Near a stone bench in the shade of an oak tree, the man stood still and held out his hand. Cortox, he said, and your name is Steenswick? Anton Steenswick. They call me Jeez, he said, tossing his head in the direction of the cafe and sat down. Anton sat next to him. He didn't need any of this. He had said what he did in spite of himself, as a reflex, the way a nerve reacts to the impulse of attending. Takes produced a pack of cigarettes, pulled one halfway out and offered it to him. Anton shook his head and faced him. Listen, he said, let's get up and walk out of here and never mention it again. There's nothing to discuss, really. What happened, happened. It doesn't bother me. Believe me, it happened over 20 years ago. I have a wife and a child and a good job. Everything is fine. I should have kept my mouth shut. Takes lit a cigarette, inhaled deeply, and gave him a grim look. But you didn't keep your mouth shut. And after a pause, so now it happened. Only at the second sentence did the smoke accompany his words. Anton nodded. Right? He said. He couldn't evade the somber, dark brown eyes staring at him. The left one was different from the right, the eyelid somewhat heavier in its piercing glance, leaving him defenseless. Take's must have been about 50, but his lank, darkish blonde hair was graying only slightly at the sideburns. Under his armpits were large sweat marks. It occurred to Anton, as in a fairy tale, that this was a man who, that evening in the winter of starvation, had killed Plug. "I was saying something you shouldn't have heard," said Take, "but you did hear, and then you said something you didn't mean to say. Those are facts, and that's why we're sitting here. I knew of your existence. How old were you then?" 12. "Did you know him, that pig?" "Only by sight," said Anton, but the word pig in connection with Plug did sound familiar. "I should think so. He came by your house regularly, and I was in the same class as his son." As he said this, he didn't remember that boy of long ago, but the big fellow who had thrown a stone in the mirror 10 years before. Wasn't his name also Fake? Yes. There were 2 other daughters besides. The youngest was 4 then. Their age, the same age as mine now. Mine is now. So, you see, those are not attenuating circumstances. Anton realized he was shivering. He felt in the presence of a nameless violence, such that he had never known in anyone except possibly in the man with a scar under his cheekbone. Should he say so? He didn't. He didn't want to give the impression that he was attacking Take's. Besides, it would be nothing new to Take's. Clearly, he had put in such considerations behind him long ago. Do you want me to tell you what sort of man this Plug was? Not for my sake, but for mine. He had a whip with barbed wire braided into it that ripped the skin off your bare ass, which he then shoved against the blazing stove. He put a garbage hose up your ass and let it run till you vomited your own shit. He killed God knows how many people and sent many more to their deaths in Germany and Poland. Very well. So, he had to be gotten rid of. Do you agree? And as Anton kept silent, yes or yes? Yes, said Anton. Okay, but on the other hand, it was clear to us that there were certain to be reprisals. Mr. Takes, Anton interrupted, am I right to assume, call me Jeez, that you are sitting here justifying yourself for my sake? I'm not criticizing you after all. I'm not justifying myself to you. To whom then? I don't know, he answered impatiently. Certainly not to myself, or to God, or some such nonsense. God doesn't exist, and perhaps I don't either. With the same index finger that he pulled the trigger, he now flicked away the cigarette butt and looked out over the cemetery. Do you know who exists? The dead. The friends who have died. As if to announce that someone was in command after all, a small cloud crept over the sun, making the flowers on the new grave look bleached, as if they were repenting. Well, the gray of the gravestones became dominant. But the next moment, everything was once more bathed in light. Anton wondered whether the sympathy he felt for the man sitting next to him had an ambiguous source. Through him, Anton was no longer simply a victim. Now, he was vicariously taking part in the violence of the assaults. A victim. Of course, he had been the victim, even though he was still alive. Yet, at the same time, he felt as if it all happened to someone else. Takes had lit another cigarette. Good. So, we knew there would be reprisals, right? That one of the houses would be set on fire, and that some of the hostages would be shot. Is that a reason for not doing it? When he kept silent, Anton looked up. Do you expect me to give you an answer? Sure, I can't do that. I don't know about that. Then I'll tell you. The answer is no. If you should tell me that your family would still be alive if he hadn't liquidated Prologue, you'd be right. That's the truth, but no more. If someone were to say that your family would still be alive if your father had rented another house on another street, that too would be the truth. Then I might be sitting here with someone else. Although it might have happened in that other street, because maybe Plug too might have lived somewhere else. Those are the kinds of truths that don't do us any good. The only truth that's useful is that everyone gets killed by whoever kills them, and by no one else. Plug by us, your family, by the Germans. If you believe we shouldn't have done it, then you also believe that, in the light of history, the human race shouldn't have existed. Because then, all the love and happiness and goodness in the world can't outweigh the life of a single child. Yours, for instance. Is that what you believe? Anton, confused, looked at the ground. He didn't quite understand it. He had never really thought about these things, but perhaps Take's never thought about anything else. So we did it. We knew. You mean that it does outweigh it? Anton asked suddenly. Take threw the cigarette at his feet and crushed it with his shoe so thoroughly that only a few shreds remained. These he covered with gravel. He did not answer the question. We knew that probably at least one of those houses would get it. The fascist gentlemen were rather consistent as far as that goes. But we didn't know which house. We had chosen that spot because it was the most secluded and the easiest to get away from. And we had to get away, for we had a few more scum like that on our list. Anton said slowly, if your parents had lived in one of those houses, would you have shot him there? Take stood up, took a few steps in his sloppy pants, and turned to him. No, damn it, of course not. What do you mean? Not if it might as well have been done somewhere else. But that same night, my youngest brother happened to be among those hostages, and I knew this. And would you like to know what my mother thought of that? She agreed that it was right to do it. She's still alive. You can ask her. Would you like her address? Anton tried to avoid looking at his left eye. You keep at me as if it were my fault. I was 12 years old and reading a book when it happened, for goodness sake. Take sat down again and lit another cigarette. It's just a stupid coincidence that it happened in front of your house. Anton eyed him sideways. It didn't happen in front of our house. Slowly, Take turned his face to him. I beg your pardon? It happened in front of the neighbor's house. They put him in front of our house. Take stretched his leg, crossed his feet, and put one hand in his pocket. Nodding, he surveyed the cemetery. Better a good neighbor than a distant friend, he said after a while. He was shaking with something, perhaps laughter. What kind of people were they? A widower and his daughter, a seaman. Take's once more nodded his head. Well, I must say, I hadn't thought of that possibility. One can always help fate along a bit. And is that morally justifiable? Asked Anton, realizing instantly that it was a childish question. Justifiable, repeated Take. You'll have to ask the clergyman about this. I believe he's still wandering around here somewhere. Some people simply take justice into their own hands. Go tell them they're wrong to do it. 3 seconds later, it would have happened in front of your door. I'm only asking, said Anton, because my brother then tried to move him up one house further, or to put him back where he was. I'm not sure, because the police arrived next. Jesus, now I'm beginning to understand, cried Take. That's why he was outside. But how did he get a hold of that gun? Anton looked at him in surprise. How do you know about the gun? Because I looked it up after the war, of course. It was Plug's gun. What an instructive afternoon, Take said slowly. He pulled out on his cigarette and blew the smoke out of the corners of his mouth. Who was living in the house, the next house further down? 2 old people, the trembling hand reaching for him. Pickles are just like crocodiles, Mr. Beamer had said. Anton had repeated this once to Sandra, but she didn't laugh. She just agreed. Yes, said Take, of course. If he'd put the body back, there would have been a fight. And then, right away, my, what a clumsy mess. A bunch of fools, all of you, trapezing up and down with that body. What else should we have done? Taken it in, of course, snarled Take. You should have dragged him in the house at once. Anton looked at him perplexed. Of course, Columbus's egg. Before he had time to say another word, Take continued. Just think, they heard shots somewhere in the neighborhood. What could they possibly have done about it if they hadn't seen anything on the street? It wouldn't occur to them that a man had been rubbed out, would it? They'd think that one of the militia had taken a shot at someone, maybe, or were your neighbor's collaborators who might have given you away. No, but what would we have done with the body? How should I know? Hidden it under the floorboards. Or buried in the gardens. Or better yet, eaten it up right away, cooked it, and shared it with the neighbors. After all, it was the winter of starvation. War criminals don't count as far as cannibals are concerned. Now laughter shook Anton. His father, the clerk, baking a police inspector and eating him for dinner. De goobly blue blue blue. Yeah, we haven't had German in this book in a while, so. Or were you under the impression that such things never happened? Forget it. Everything has happened. The weirdest thing you can think of have happened, and weirder yet. The people strolling back and forth to the grave eyed them in passing. 2 men on a stone bench under a tree, one younger than the others, still mourning their lost friend, while the others were sitting in the bar, exchanging memories. Do you remember that time that as they walked by, they fell thoroughly silent? It's easy for you to say, said Anton. You thought of nothing else but this sort of thing, and it seems to me you still do. Whereas we were sitting at home, reading around the dining room table, and then suddenly we heard those shots. I still would have thought about I still would have thought of it at once. Maybe, but then you were part of a gang. My father was a clerk who never took action. He just wrote down the actions of others. We wouldn't have had time anyways, although, he said, looking up suddenly into the leaves overhead, we had a kind of quarrel. In spite of the brilliance of the day, a scene flashed through his mind, some obscure activity taking place in total darkness in a hall. An exclamation, as if Peter were stumbling over some branches. Something about a key. It disappeared like the shred of a dream briefly remembered the next morning. He was brought back to reality by Takes, who drew 4 lines in the gravel with his seal, making this design in the bare earth. It's like in the book, and it's like 4 lines. It's really amazing. Listen, he said, there were 4 houses, weren't there? Yes. And you lived in the second house from the left. You've got a good memory. I go back there now and then. Heroes always return to the scene. It's a well-known fact. Although, quite probably, I'm the only one, at least as far as that quay of yours is concerned. Now, as far as I knew, he was lying here in front of your house. At which neighbors was he shot? This one or this one? This one, said Anton, and he pointed with his shoe to the second house from the right. Takes nodded and looked at the stripes. Excuse me, but in that case, there's a mystery. Why did the seaman deposit him at your doorstep and not here at his other neighbors? Anton, too, looked at the stripes. No idea. I've never wondered about it. There must be a reason. Did he dislike you? Not as far as I know. I used to go there sometimes. I should think that they have been more inclined to dislike the people on the other side who ignored everyone else on the street. And you never tried to find out? Asked Take, surprised. Don't you care at all? Care. I told you, I don't feel any need to go over all that again. What happened, and that's all there is to it. It can't be changed now, even if I understood it. It was wartime, one big disaster. My family was murdered, and I stayed alive. I was adopted by my aunt and uncle, and everything turned out all right for me. You were right to kill the bastard. Really, I have no complaints about that. You just convince his son. With me, that's not necessary. But why in God's name do you want to make it all logical? That's impossible, and who cares? It's history, ancient history. How many times has the same sort of thing happened since? It may be happening right now somewhere, while we're sitting here talking. Could you swear, your hand in the fire, that at this very moment someone's house somewhere isn't being set on fire by a flamethrower? In Vietnam, for instance. What are you talking about? When you took me outside just now, I thought maybe you were concerned about my peace of mind. But that doesn't seem to be the case, at least not altogether. You're more upset than I am. It seems to me that you can't leave the war alone, but time goes on. Or do you regret what you did? He had spoken fast, but calmly, yet with a vague feeling that he must be careful, that he must control himself so as not to hit the other. I'd do it again tomorrow if necessary, said Takes without hesitation, and maybe I will do it again tomorrow. I've rubbed out a whole rat's nest of that scum, and the fact still gives me satisfaction. But the incident of the quay of yours, there was more to it. Something happened there. He clasped the edge of the bench and shifted his position. Let's just say that I wish we hadn't gone through with it. Because my parents were killed as well? No, said Takes roughly. I'm sorry to say that's not the reason. That couldn't have been foreseen or expected. It probably happened because they caught your brother with a gun, or because of something else, or for no reason. I don't know. It probably happened, said Anton without looking up, because my mother flew at the leaders of those Germans. Takes was silent and stared straight ahead. At last he turned to Anton and said, I'm really not torturing you, just to satisfy my nostalgia for the war, in case you're wondering. I know people like that, but I'm not one of them. Those people spend all their holidays in Berlin and would just love to hang a portrait of Hitler over their beds. No, the problem is that something else happened over there in Harlem. A light went on in his eyes. Anton saw his Adam's apple bob up and down a couple of times. Your parents and your brother and those hostages were not the only ones who lost their lives. The fact is, I wasn't alone when I shot Plug. There were 2 of us. Someone was with me. Someone who... Let's just say she was my girlfriend, but never mind. Leave it at that. Anton stared at him, and suddenly all the pent-up emotion washed over him, putting his face in his hands. He turned away and began to sob. She was dying. For him, she died at this very moment, as if 21 years were nothing. Yet, at the same time, she was resurrected together, all she had meant to him. Hidden there in the darkness, if he had ever thought about her in these 21 years, he would have wondered whether she were still alive. But, just now, he realized he had been looking for her in the church, and later in the cafe. And in the fact, it was the reason why he had come to the funeral when he had no need to be there. He felt Take's hand on his shoulder. What's this about? He dropped his hands. His eyes were dry. How did she die? They shot her in the dunes 3 weeks before liberation. She's buried there in the memorial ceremony. But why should you care so much? Because I know her, Anton said softly. Because I talked to her, spent the night with her in the cell. No way! Okay. Takes looked at him in disbelief. How do you know it was her? What's her name? Surely she didn't tell you who she was. No, but I'm quite sure. Did she tell you that she was involved in the assault? Anton shook his head. No, not even that, but I'm quite certain. How can you be, for God's sake? Take said crossly. What did she look like? I don't know. It was pitch black. Take thought for a while. Would you recognize her if you saw a picture? I never really saw her, Take, but I'd very much like to see her picture. But what did she say? You must know something. Anton shrugged. I wish I did. It was so long ago. She had been wounded. Where? I don't know. Tears came to Take's eyes. It must have been her, he said. If she didn't even mention her name. Plug took a final shot at her, just as we were about to turn the corner. When Anton saw Take's tears, he began to weep himself. What was her name? He asked. True's Coaster. Now, the people around the grave were watching them, discreetly but steadily. They must have been surprised to see two grown men so much affected by the death of their friend. Some may have wondered if they were showing off. There they are, the silly fools, his mother-in-law's voice. She entered the gate, Saskia and Sandra in her wake, 2 figures in black and a child in white against the blinding gravel. Sandra called, Papa, dropped her doll, and ran toward Anton. He picked her up and held her in her arms. From Saskia's wide-eyed look, he could tell that she was worried about him, and he nodded to her reassuringly. But her mother, leaning on the shiny black cane with the silver handle, would not be fobbed off that easily. Good Lord, are they actually crying? She asked angrily. At which Sandra looked up to Anton. Mr. Graff pretended to gag. You two make me positively ill. Can't you stop carrying on about that rotten war? Tell me, Jiz, do you enjoy torturing my son-in-law? Yes, of course you would. She gave a strange, mocking laugh, and her wobbly cheeks shook. This is impossible, the way you two stand there like exposed necrophiles, and in the cemetery of all places. Stop it at once. Come along, all of you. She turned about and walked away, pointing at the doll that lay in the gravel, not doubting for a minute that she would be obeyed. And so she was. Isn't she amazing, said Take's with an also peculiar laugh. It was evident he dealt with her before, and at Anton's puzzled look, he said, Queen Wilhelmina. As they walked back to the square, the child took them that she had gone with her mother to the house of the dead man, and had given 2 glasses of orange glade. The cafe was emptying. At the entrance stood the car with the official insignia, its driver stationed by the back door. Anton was being closely observed, but no one bothered him. Sandra and her mother went into the cafe to fetch the Graff. Saskia, the doll in her hand, said that Sandra absolutely must have something to eat. She had already suggested to Mr. Graff that they have lunch together somewhere in the country. Just stand still a minute, said Take. Anton felt Take scribbling something on his back. Saskia was once more observing him with a worried look, and he closed his eyes for an instant to signal her that he was all right. Take tore a sheet out of his diary, folded it, and put it in Anton's breast pocket. In silence, they shook hands. He nodded to Saskia and went into the cafe. By the sidewalks, Jap was starting up his scooter. Just as he managed it, the Minister of de Graaf came out. The driver took off his cap and opened the door. But first, the minister went to Jap and shook his hand. See you soon, Jap. Yes, said Jap. Until next time, I guess. That was a long one.